Welcome to the channel, Stories of Slavery. Today's story takes place in 1859. A black boy saved an enslaved giant woman from death, and what happened afterward was inexplicable, bizarre, and impossible. This is a difficult and intense story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps keep these stories remembered instead of buried. Let's begin. On the night of September 14, 1859, in the swamps of Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, a group of men prepared to burn a woman alive. She stood 8 feet tall. She weighed over 300 pounds, and she was worth exactly nothing to the men who owned her. But hidden in the cypress trees, watching through the Spanish moss, was a 17-year-old boy who was about to change everything. His name was Isaac Mercer. And what he did that night was so impossible, so unlikely, so completely against every law of nature and man that for over 100 years, historians refused to believe it happened at all. This is the true story of how a young man saved a giant and how that giant in her final days taught him what it really meant to be free. Louisiana in 1859 was a different world, not just different from today, but different from anywhere else on earth. The Mississippi River Delta spread across the land like the fingers of a giant hand, creating a maze of waterways, swamps, and fertile soil that produced more cotton than any other place in America. In that single year, Louisiana plantations shipped over 700,000 bales of cotton to mills in England and New England. Each bale weighed 400 pounds. Each pound required human hands to plant, tend, pick, and pack. Those hands belonged to enslaved people. Over 300,000 of them lived and worked in Louisiana in 1859. They had no rights, they had no freedom, they had no future except what their owners decided for them. Under Louisiana law, they were not people at all. They were property like horses or furniture to be bought, sold, used, and discarded. The Bellamy plantation sat 12 miles north of Homer in the heart of sugarcane country. It covered nearly 2,000 acres of rich black soil worked by 147 enslaved men, women, and children. The owner was a man named Cornelius Bellamy, a third-generation planter whose grandfather had come from Virginia in 1792 with 12 enslaved people and a dream of building an empire. That empire now produced over 800 hogsheads of sugar every year. Each hogshead held 1,000. At the 1859 price of 6 cents per pound, the Bellamy plantation generated nearly $50,000 in annual revenue. That was more money than most Americans would see in 10 lifetimes. Isaac Mercer was born on this plantation in the spring of 1842. His mother, a woman named Ruth, worked in the main house as a cook and seamstress. His father was unknown, though whispers in the slave quarters suggested he might have been one of the Bellamy sons who died of yellow fever in 1851. Isaac inherited his mother's sharp mind and quiet nature. He also inherited something far more dangerous: curiosity. From the time he could walk, Isaac watched everything. He watched the overseers count bales. He watched the bookkeeper make marks in his ledger. He watched the Bellamy children sit on the porch with their tutors, learning to read and write and cipher, and he memorized everything he saw. By the age of 10, Isaac had taught himself to recognize letters. By 12, he could sound out simple words. By 15, he was stealing moments with discarded newspapers and old almanacs, piecing together the mystery of written language one fragment at a time. This was a crime punishable by whipping, mutilation, or death. Louisiana law made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. The punishment for a white person teaching literacy was a fine of up to $500 and possible imprisonment. The punishment for an enslaved person learning to read was left to the owner's discretion, which often meant whatever cruelty they felt like inflicting. Isaac knew the risk. He kept his knowledge hidden, even from his mother. He pretended to be slow and simple, the kind of young man that white people overlooked. He made himself invisible. And invisible people, he discovered, could go anywhere and see anything. By 17, Isaac had grown tall and strong with broad shoulders and hands calloused from labor. He worked in the fields during harvest season and in the stables the rest of the year. The overseers considered him reliable but unremarkable, which was exactly what he wanted them to think. Behind his quiet exterior, his mind was constantly working, absorbing information, planning for a future that seemed impossible, but that he refused to stop imagining. The woman they called the Giant Tess arrived at the Bellamy plantation in the summer of 1857. Isaac was 15 years old at the time. He was helping unload supplies from a wagon when he saw her for the first time, and the sight stopped him cold. She sat in the back of an open cart, her legs folded beneath her because there was no room to stretch them out. Even sitting, her head rose higher than the driver's. Her skin was dark as river mud, and her eyes held a weariness that Isaac had never seen before, not even in the oldest field hands, who had worked their whole lives under the Louisiana sun. The driver was a man named Patterson, a slave trader who operated out of New Orleans. He specialized in unusual merchandise. People came from across the South to buy from Patterson when they wanted something different. Albinos, twins, people with extra fingers or missing limbs, and giants. Patterson announced to Cornelius Bellamy that the woman measured 8 feet and 1 inch tall. He claimed she was the tallest woman in the Americas, maybe the tallest in the world. Bellamy circled the wagon slowly, examining her the way he would examine a horse or a piece of furniture. He complained that she looked half dead, and Patterson admitted she was tired from the 3-week journey from Virginia, but insisted she was stronger than any 2 men. The negotiation took 20 minutes. They settled on $350 plus Patterson's room and board for the night, and $50 plus Patterson's room and board for the night. The deal was sealed with a handshake. The woman was officially the property of the Bellamy plantation. That night, Isaac's mother told him the woman's real story. The enslaved people had their own information networks, faster and more reliable than any newspaper. Within hours of the woman's arrival, Ruth knew everything. Her real name was Adise. She was not from Virginia. She was from a place called Igbo land on the coast of West Africa in what is now southeastern Nigeria. She was captured at the age of 12 during a raid on her village and sold to Portuguese traders who shipped her across the Atlantic in the belly of a slave ship. Of the 400 people who began that journey, only 216 survived. Adise's height came from her bloodline. Her father had been a chief, her mother a priestess. In her village, tall stature was considered a sign of divine favor. The tallest members of the community became warriors, leaders, intermediaries between the human world and the spirit world. Adai had been destined for greatness. Instead, she became property. For 20 years, she was passed from owner to owner. Some bought her as a curiosity to show off at parties and impress their neighbors. Some rented her out to traveling shows and circuses where white people paid money to gawk at her. Some tried to breed her, hoping to produce more giants they could sell at premium prices. None of her children inherited her height. All of them were taken from her before they were old enough to remember her face. By the time she reached the Bellamy plantation, her disease had stopped speaking. She had stopped hoping. She had stopped being a person in any way that mattered to herself. She was simply waiting to die. Cornelius Bellamy had plans for her. He saw profit where others saw burden. The fall social season was approaching, and planters from across Louisiana would gather for parties, balls, and business deals. A genuine African giantess would be the talk of every gathering. Bellamy could charge admission to see her. He could rent her out for special events. He could make back his investment 10 times over. For the first few months, his plan worked. Adise became famous across Terrebonne Parish. People traveled from as far as New Orleans to see the giant woman. Bellamy dressed her in fine clothes specially made by seamstresses in Baton Rouge. He taught her to bow and curtsy and perform simple tricks. He made her lift heavy objects and carry men on her shoulders like children. But fame has a short memory and curiosity fades quickly. By the summer of 1858, the crowds had dwindled. By the fall, they stopped coming altogether. Ad was no longer a novelty. She was just an expensive mouth to feed. That winter, her health began to fail. She developed a cough that would not go away. Her joints swelled and ached. She could no longer lift the loads she once carried. The plantation doctor examined her and delivered his verdict. Her heart was giving out. People of unusual size often suffered this fate. Their bodies simply could not sustain themselves. He gave her a year, perhaps 2 if she rested, but rest was not something enslaved people were permitted. Bellamy put her to work in the sugar mill, where her height allowed her to reach machinery that others could not. She worked 18-hour days during grinding season, feeding cane into the crushers while the furnaces roared and the syrup boiled. The work broke her down faster than the doctor had predicted. By the summer of 1859, Ada could barely walk. She spent most of her time in a small cabin at the edge of the slave quarters, too weak to work, but too valuable to simply let die. Bellamy discussed his options with his overseer, a man named Silas Crenshaw. The doctor bills were mounting. The special food she required was expensive. She was costing more than she was worth. The solution was simple, though it could not be spoken aloud in polite company. Louisiana law technically required owners to provide basic care for their enslaved people, but the law also looked the other way when enslaved people had accidents, when they wandered into the swamp and were never seen again, when they fell ill with sudden fevers and died before anyone could send for a doctor. On the night of September 14, 1859, Silas Crenshaw and 4 other men loaded Adise onto a cart and drove her into the bayou. They told anyone who asked that they were taking her to see a healer in the next parish, but the cart was loaded with lamp oil and firewood, and the men carried torches instead of medicine. Isaac saw them go. He was supposed to be asleep in his mother's cabin, but he had snuck out to retrieve a book he had hidden near the smokehouse. He watched from the shadows as the cart rolled past, and he saw Ada's face in the moonlight. She looked at him. Their eyes met for just a moment, and in that moment, something passed between them that Isaac would never be able to explain. He followed them. He did not decide to follow them. His feet simply began to move. He stayed in the shadows, using every trick he had learned in 17 years of being invisible. He moved from tree to tree, from bush to bush, always staying downwind, always staying silent. The men were not being careful. They did not expect anyone to follow. They laughed and passed a bottle of whiskey as they drove deeper into the swamp. After about an hour, they stopped in a clearing near the water's edge. Isaac crept as close as he dared and hid behind a fallen cypress log. In the mud, her enormous body curled like in the mud. Her enormous body curled like a child's, waiting for whatever came next. Crenshaw stood over her with a torch in his hand, announcing that Bellamy wanted it to look like an accident, but that out here nobody would find anything but bones. One of the other men, a young overseer named Davis, looked uneasy, questioning whether this was right since she had not done anything wrong. Crenshaw dismissed the concern, arguing that she was eating food and taking up space without giving anything back. He claimed they were doing her a favor by putting her out of her misery. They piled the firewood around her body. They soaked it with lamp oil. The smell filled the clearing, sharp and chemical and wrong. Adise still did not move. Her eyes were open, staring at the sky through the canopy of leaves, and Isaac thought he saw her lips moving, praying maybe, or saying goodbye. Crenshaw lifted his torch and asked if she had any last words. She did not answer. She did not even look at him. Crenshaw drew back his arm to throw the torch, and Isaac Mercer stepped out of the shadows. He did not know why he did it. He did not have a plan. He was 17 years old, strong but unarmed. He was facing 5 grown men with torches and knives and guns. There was nothing logical about what he was doing, but he stepped forward anyway. The men spun around, reaching for their weapons. When they saw it was just a young slave from the plantation, they relaxed slightly. Crenshaw actually laughed, asking what Isaac was doing out here and whether he was lost. Isaac's mind raced. He needed a lie. He needed a reason to be here that would not get him killed. He needed something that would make these men listen to him. He told them that Mr. Bellamy had sent him, that the master had changed his mind and wanted them to bring her back. Crenshaw's eyes narrowed with suspicion, questioning why Bellamy would send a slave to deliver such a message instead of one of the house staff. Isaac explained that everyone else was asleep and that Bellamy did not want to wake them because he wanted it kept quiet. Davis and one of the other men exchanged glances. It was plausible. Bellamy was known for his strange whims and his obsessive secrecy. He hated it when his business became public gossip. But Crenshaw was not convinced. He stepped closer to Isaac, holding the torch near the young man's face. He accused Isaac of lying, claiming he could see it in his eyes. Isaac did not flinch. He had learned long ago that flinching only made things worse. He insisted that Bellamy was waiting at the house and would be angry if they did not bring her back. Crenshaw studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was the worst smile Isaac had ever seen. He announced that he thought Isaac had followed them out here on his own, that nobody knew where he was, and that if they put him on that pile with the giantesses, nobody would ever know what happened to either of them. He grabbed Isaac by the collar and dragged him toward the pile of wood where Adise lay, announcing that they would get 2 for the price of 1. Isaac looked down at Adise. She was looking back at him now, her dark eyes filled with something he had not seen in them before. Not hope exactly, something deeper, something fiercer. She moved faster than anyone thought possible, faster than her broken body should have allowed. One enormous hand shot out and grabbed Crenshaw's ankle. She yanked and he went down hard, dropping Isaac in the torch. The torch landed in the mud and sputtered out. Adise pulled herself up onto her knees. In the moonlight, she looked like something out of a nightmare, 8 feet of shadow and rage rising from the earth like a spirit of vengeance. She told Isaac to run. Her voice was deep as thunder, rough from years of silence. She commanded him to run and not look back. The men were scrambling for their weapons. Davis had a pistol out. Another man was reaching for a knife. There was no time for debate. Isaac grabbed Daisy's hand and told her to come with him. She protested that she could not run, that she could barely walk, and urged him to save himself. Isaac refused. He told her to lean on him, that they would go together. But they had to go now. Later, Isaac could never explain what happened next. He pulled on her hand and she rose. She leaned on his shoulder and somehow he did not collapse under her weight. They moved into the darkness of the swamp, leaving the clearing behind, leaving the men and their torches and their murder behind. It should not have been possible. Adis weighed over 300 pounds. Isaac was strong for his age, but not that strong. Yet something happened in that moment. Something that defied physics and logic and everything that should have been true. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was something else entirely. Something that could not be measured or explained. All Isaac knew was that they were moving through the cypress trees, through the knee-deep water, through the darkness and the danger. He could hear the men shouting behind them, spreading out to search. He could hear dogs barking somewhere in the distance, but he kept moving one step at a time with the weight of a giant on his shoulders. They traveled all night. Isaac knew the swamp better than most. He had explored it in secret over the years, mapping its paths and waterways in his mind. He knew where the ground was solid and where it would swallow you whole. He knew where the alligators nested and where the water moccasins hunted. He knew which direction led deeper into the wilderness and which led back to the plantation. He chose deeper. Every step took them further from everything he had ever known. By dawn, they had covered nearly 5 miles. It was not far enough to be safe, but it was far enough to rest. Isaac found a small island of high ground surrounded by water on 3 sides. A massive fallen oak provided shelter from the sun. He helped Ade lower herself to the ground and then he collapsed beside her. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply breathed, recovering from the impossible night. Finally, Ada broke the silence. She asked why he had done that. Isaac thought about the question. He had been asking himself the same thing. He admitted that he did not know that he had seen them taking her away, seen her face, and could not just let it happen. She pointed out that he could have died, that he almost did die. Isaac replied that so did she. She looked at him with those ancient eyes and explained that she had been ready to die, that she had been ready for a long time, but he was young with his whole life ahead of him. She wanted to know why he would risk it for someone like her. Isaac did not have an answer, at least not one he could put into words. He just knew that when he saw her lying there in the mud, waiting for the fire to take her, something inside him had refused to accept it. Something had said, no, not this, not now, not while he could still do something. He told her that his mother used to share stories about people who did impossible things, people who fought against the darkness when everyone else gave up. He had always thought those were just stories. But that night when he saw her, he wondered if the stories were true, if people really could do impossible things if they just tried hard enough. Adis was quiet for a long moment. Then for the first time in years, she laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but it was real. She told him he was a strange young man. She revealed that she knew his name, that she knew everyone's name. She watched and listened, even when people thought she was not there. She knew that he could read, that he snuck out at night to practice, that he hid books in the smokehouse. Isaac's blood went cold, but she assured him that his secret was safe with her. He had saved her life. That was not a debt she would ever be able to repay. The first day in the swamp was the hardest. Isaac had no supplies, no tools, no plan. All he had was his wits and his knowledge of the land. He gathered what food he could find. Berries, roots, a turtle he caught near the water's edge. He built a small fire using a technique he had read about in a book, spinning a stick against dry wood until it smoldered. It took him over an hour, but eventually the flames caught. Adis was too weak to help with any of this. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing shallow and labored. The escape had taken everything she had left. Isaac feared she might die before they could reach safety. But where was safety? They were deep in the Louisiana swamp, hundreds of miles from the nearest free state. Even if they could travel, the roads and rivers were watched by slave patrols. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that even reaching the north was no guarantee of freedom. Escaped enslaved people could be captured and returned from anywhere in the country. Isaac had heard whispers about something called the Underground Railroad. It was not a real railroad, but a network of secret routes and safe houses that helped enslaved people escape to freedom. The network stretched from the Deep South all the way to Canada, where slavery was illegal and escaped people could not be returned. But the Underground Railroad was just a rumor to most enslaved people in Louisiana. The Deep South was far from the network's main routes. The closest safe houses were hundreds of miles away in Missouri or Kentucky. Getting there would require crossing the entire state of Louisiana, then Mississippi, then Tennessee. It would take weeks, maybe months, and they would be hunted every step of the way. On the second day, Ada was strong enough to talk. She told Isaac her story, the real story, the one she had never told anyone in America. She was born in 1825 in a village called Encare in the heart of Igboland. Her father was an Obi, a chief who led a community of over 3,000 people. Her mother was a Dia, a priestess who communed with the spirits of their ancestors. Adise was their only daughter, born during an eclipse, which her people considered a sign of great destiny. From birth, she was marked as different. She grew faster than other children, surpassing her peers before she could walk. By her 10th birthday, she was taller than any adult in the village. The elders said she was blessed by the gods, chosen to be a warrior and protector of her people. Then the slavers came. They attacked at night during a festival when the ville's defenses were down. They came with guns and chains, and a hunger for human cargo. Addie's father died trying to protect his people. Her mother was killed when she refused to be separated from her daughter. Ads herself was beaten unconscious and woke up in chains surrounded by strangers being marched toward the coast. The march took 3 weeks. Many people died along the way from exhaustion, disease, or despair. Those who could not keep up were left behind to die or shot where they fell. Ada survived because of her size and strength, but she lost something on that march that she would never get back. She lost her faith in the world. The slave ship was worse. Ada spent 2 months in the belly of that vessel, chained to strangers in a space so small she could not stand up straight. The smell was beyond description. The sounds were beyond imagination. People died every day, their bodies thrown overboard to feed the sharks that followed the ship. Adise survived by going somewhere else in her mind, retreating to a place where none of this was real. When she finally reached America, she was sold at auction in Charleston, South Carolina. The buyers examined her like livestock, checking her teeth and muscles, discussing her breeding potential. She was 12 years old. For the next 20 years, she was passed from owner to owner. Some were cruel, some were kind in their own limited way. All of them saw her as property, as a thing to be used for their benefit. She learned to speak English, though she refused to forget her native tongue. She learned to work, though she never stopped dreaming of home. She learned to survive, though part of her died a little more with each passing year. She had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. All 3 were taken from her before they reached their 3rd birthday, sold to other plantations, sent to lives she would never know. She tried to find them, tried to learn what happened to them. But the slave system was designed to erase those connections. Her children were scattered across the South like seeds in the wind, and she would never see any of them again. By the time she reached the Bellamy plantation, Ada had given up hope. She was waiting to die. She expected to die. And then a young man appeared in the darkness and told her to run. Isaac listened to her story without interrupting. When she finished, he found himself weeping. He had heard stories of the Middle Passage before, whispered in the slave quarters late at night, but hearing it from someone who had lived it, someone who was sitting right beside him, made it real in a way that nothing else could. He told her he was sorry. It was not enough. It would never be enough, but it was all he had. Adai touched his face with her enormous hand, gentle as a mother's touch. She told him he had nothing to be sorry for, that he did not do this to her. He was trying to undo it. That made him different from almost every other person she had met in this country. Isaac asked what they were going to do, how they were going to get to freedom. Adise smiled, and for a moment she looked almost young again. She pointed out that he was asking her, the one who was ready to die while he was the one who would not let her. He must have a plan. Isaac did not have a plan, but he had something better. He had books. Over the years, he had read everything he could get his hands on. Newspapers, almanacs, novels, histories. He had read about the geography of the United States. He had read about the rivers and roads and cities. He had read about the Underground Railroad and the brave people who operated it. And he had read about something that most enslaved people never learned, the specific routes that escaped people used to reach freedom. There was a path. It was dangerous and long and uncertain, but it existed. Isaac explained his plan. They would go north, following the rivers when they could, traveling by night, hiding during the day. There were people along the way who would help them, both black and white. They had safe houses, places where runaways could rest and get supplies. If they could reach Kentucky, they could cross into Ohio, and from Ohio, they could get to Canada. Adai looked at him with wonder, asking if he had learned all this from books. Isaac confirmed it, explaining that he had also learned from listening. The enslaved people talked about these things when they thought nobody was paying attention. He was always paying attention. She asked how far it was and how long it would take. Isaac had calculated this in his head many times, though he never imagined he would actually make the journey. It was about 700 meters to the Ohio River, traveling at night, hiding during the day, maybe 15 meters per day if they were lucky. That was nearly 50 days, almost 2 months. Adai pointed out that she could not walk 15 miles in a day, that she could barely walk at all. Isaac replied that they would go slower, that they would rest when she needed to rest, that they would take as long as they needed to take. She warned him that the men would come after them, that they would bring dogs and guns and more men. They would not stop until they found them. Isaac acknowledged this, but pointed out that they had a head start, and they had something the hunters did not have. When she asked what that was, Isaac explained that they had nothing to lose. The hunters had plantations and money and reputations to protect. They could not spend forever chasing 2 slaves into the wilderness. Eventually, they would give up. But Isaac and Ada would never give up because giving up meant death. Ada studied this young man, this impossible young man who had appeared in her darkest moment and pulled her back from the edge. She had lived 32 years, traveled halfway around the world, survived horrors that most people could not imagine, and here was a 17-year-old teaching her about hope. She asked if he really believed they could do it. Isaac thought about the question. Did he believe it? The logical part of his mind said no. The odds were impossibly long. They had no supplies, no weapons, no money. They were being hunted by men who knew the land better than they did. A days could barely walk. Everything was against them. But there was another part of his mind, a deeper part that refused to accept those odds. That part remembered the stories his mother had told him. It remembered the moment in the clearing when he had stood up to face 5 armed men. It remembered the impossible night walk through the swamp, carrying a woman who weighed twice what he did. He told her that he believed they had to try, and he believed that sometimes when you tried hard enough, impossible things became possible. That afternoon they heard the dogs. The sound came from the south, still distant, but getting closer. The baying of hounds on a scent, the most terrifying sound in the world to a runaway slave. Bellamy had sent hunters after them. Isaac helped Days to her feet. She was stronger than she had been the day before, but still far from healthy. Every step was an effort. Every breath was a struggle. They headed north into the deepest part of the swamp. Isaac had read that dogs lost scent trails in water, so he led them through every stream and pond they could find. The water was cold and full of hidden dangers, but it was better than being caught. They walked until dark, then kept walking. The dogs fell behind, confused by the water, but Isaac knew they would not give up easily. Professional slave hunters were paid by the capture. They would follow the trail for days, weeks if necessary. The only way to escape was to get far enough ahead that the trail went cold completely. Around midnight, they found shelter in an abandoned trapper's cabin. It was falling apart, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was dry and hidden from view. They collapsed inside, too exhausted to do anything but sleep. Isaac woke before dawn. Adai was still sleeping. Her massive body curled in the corner like a child's. In sleep, she looked peaceful, almost happy. Isaac wondered what she was dreaming about. Her village, maybe her family, the life she might have had if the slavers had never come. He crept outside to survey their surroundings. The swamp stretched in every direction, a maze of water and trees in danger, but to the north he could see something that made his heart leap, a road. It was just a dirt track, barely wide enough for a wagon, but it was a road, and roads led somewhere. Roads meant civilization, which meant danger, but also opportunity. People on roads might help them, or they might turn them in. It was a gamble either way. Isaac made a decision. They would follow the road north, but stay hidden in the trees alongside it. They would watch for travelers and try to determine who was friendly and who was not. It was risky, but staying in the swamp forever was not an option. They needed supplies, medicine, information. They needed help. When Adis woke, he told her his plan. She listened without comment, then nodded slowly. She told him that he was wise beyond his years, that in her country he would be destined for great things, a chief perhaps, or a priest. Isaac replied that in this country he was just property. She corrected him, saying that in this country he was a miracle, and he should not forget that. They set out at dusk following the tree line alongside the road. Progress was slow but steady. Adise leaned on Isaac's shoulder, taking some of her weight off her failing legs. Isaac pointed out landmarks as they walked, teaching her to recognize the signs of human habitation: smoke trails, cleared fields, the distant lowing of cattle. Near midnight, they saw lights ahead, a small settlement, maybe a dozen buildings clustered around a crossroads. Isaac could make out a general store, a church, and what looked like a blacksmith shop. Dangerous territory for runaways, but also an opportunity. Isaac told her Dies to wait while he got closer to see what they were dealing with. She grabbed his arm, protesting that it was too dangerous, that if they caught him, there would be no escape. Isaac assured her that they would not catch him. He was invisible. Nobody ever noticed him. Before she could argue, he slipped away into the darkness. He moved through the trees like a ghost, silent and unseen. Years of practice had made him expert at this kind of movement. He could get within feet of someone without them knowing he was there. The settlement was quiet at this hour. Most of the buildings were dark, their occupants asleep, but there was light coming from the church, and Isaac could hear voices inside. He crept closer, pressing himself against the wall beneath an open window. The men inside were discussing the search. They talked about a $300 reward, dead or alive, that Bellamy was putting up himself. They mentioned how hard it would be to miss an 8-foot woman and expressed surprise that she had help from the Mercer boy, who they heard was smart for a Negro and had learned to read somehow. One man observed that a reading slave was worse than a runaway, that it was a threat to the whole system. Another agreed, explaining that Bellamy wanted them caught before word spread. He asked the others to imagine what would happen if the other slaves found out that a young man and a crippled giantess had escaped right under his nose. It would give them ideas. Isaac had heard enough. He crept back to where Adai was waiting and told her what he had learned. $300 was an enormous sum. It would bring every bounty hunter in Louisiana down on their heads. He told her they had to move faster to get out of the state before the hunters could organize a proper search. She replied that she would try, but her body was failing her. Isaac thought for a moment, then an idea came to him. Crazy and desperate and probably impossible. But impossible was becoming their specialty. He explained that there was a blacksmith in that town and a general store. If he could get in without being seen, he might be able to find something to help her. A crutch maybe, or a cart they could steal. Ada protested that it was too risky, reminding him what the men had said about the search. Isaac pointed out that they were looking for an 8-foot woman and a 17-year-old traveling together. They were not looking for a young man alone. He could be in and out before anyone knew he was there. Adise wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. She could barely walk. Without help, without supplies, they would never make it to freedom. The only chance was to take risks. She told him to be careful, that he was the only hope she had left. Isaac slipped back toward the town. The streets were empty now, the church meeting apparently over. He made his way to the general store first, finding a back window that had been left slightly open. He squeezed through, dropping silently into a storeroom filled with goods. He worked quickly, filling a burlap sack with what they needed most: dried meat, hard tack, a knife, a length of rope, a box of matches. He also found a bottle of laudanum, a powerful painkiller that might help with a Daisy's joint pain. Every item was a risk, but every item might be the difference between life and death. On his way out, he spotted something that made him freeze. Hanging on the wall behind the counter was a wanted poster freshly printed. It showed rough sketches of 2 faces, a gigantic woman and a young man. The reward was listed as $500 now, not $30. Someone had raised the stakes. Isaac tore the poster from the wall and stuffed it in his sack. Then he climbed back out the window and disappeared into the night. The next few days established a pattern that would define their journey. They traveled at night, following roads when they could, cutting through wilderness when they had to. During the day, they hid in whatever shelter they could find: caves, abandoned buildings, dense thicket of brush. Isaac foraged for food when their supplies ran low. Adise rested and recovered, her strength slowly returning. The laudanum helped. It dulled the constant pain in her joints, allowed her to walk further and faster, but Isaac rationed it carefully. Addiction to such medicines was common, and he had seen what it could do to people. He gave her just enough to function, no more. They talked as they traveled. Isaac told the days about his life on the Bellamy plantation, about his secret reading, about his dreams of freedom. Adise told him about Igbo land, about her family, about the traditions and beliefs of her people. She taught him words in her native language, and he taught her about American geography and history. They were teacher and student to each other, learning and growing with every mile. On the fifth day, they reached the Mississippi River. It stretched before them like an ocean, wide and brown and powerful. The far shore was barely visible through the morning mist. Somewhere on the other side was Mississippi, then Tennessee, then Kentucky, then Ohio. Somewhere on the other side was freedom. But first, they had to cross. Isaac had read about the Mississippi. He knew it was the most important waterway in America, carrying goods and people from the northern territories all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. He knew that steamboats traveled up and down its length day and night. He knew that the river was watched by slave patrols who specifically looked for runaways trying to cross. He also knew that there were ferries, small boats operated by people who would carry passengers across for a fee. Some of these ferry operators were known to help runaways for the right price. Others would turn them in for the reward. They spent 2 days camped near the riverbank, hidden in a grove of cottonwood trees. Isaac watched the ferry landings, studying the operators, trying to read their characters from a distance. Most looked like ordinary men, neither good nor evil, just trying to make a living. But there was one who caught his attention. He was a black man, which was unusual. Most ferry operators were white. He was old, maybe 60, with gray in his hair and a limp in his walk. He wore simple clothes and spoke to everyone with the same quiet respect. Whether they were wealthy travelers or poor farmers, Isaac watched him for a full day before making his decision. Something about the old man felt right, something in the way he moved, the way he treated people. It was a gamble, but everything they did was a gamble. That night, Isaac crept down to the ferry landing. The old man was sitting alone by a small fire, cooking something in a battered pot. Isaac stepped out of the shadows and cleared his throat. The old man looked up. His eyes were sharp, taking in everything about Isaac in a single glance. He observed that Isaac was the boy they were looking for. Isaac's heart stopped. He started to deny it, but the old man held up his hand. The old man told Isaac not to lie to him, that he was too old for lies. He had seen the posters, read the descriptions. A reading slave, they said, smart as a whip, traveling with a giant woman. Not many people matching those descriptions were wandering around Louisiana. Isaac prepared to run, but the old man calmed him, explaining that he had not said he was going to turn them in. He invited Isaac to sit down and have some stew, observing that the young man looked like he had not eaten properly in days. Isaac hesitated. Every instinct told him to flee, but something else, something deeper, told him to stay. He sat down by the fire. The old man introduced himself as Abraham. He had been running the ferry for 30 years. He explained that he was born free, that his parents were freed by their owner's will before he was born. He had never been property, never worn chains, never felt the whip, but he had watched his people suffer for 60 years, and he had done what he could to help. Isaac asked if he helped runaways. Abraham laughed, saying he had been helping runaways since before Isaac's mother was born. He explained that was how he got his limp. A slave catcher shot him back in 1839 when he was helping a family get across. They made it to Ohio. He made it to the doctor. He had been walking funny ever since. Isaac felt hope surge in his chest. He asked if Abraham could help them, if he could take them across. Abraham asked about the giant first, wanting to know if she was real. Isaac confirmed everything, 8 feet and 1 inch. Her name was AIDS. She was from Africa. She was sick, but she was strong. She was the bravest person Isaac had ever met. Abraham studied Isaac's face for a long moment, then asked about him. How did a young man learn to read on a Louisiana plantation? Isaac told him, not everything, but enough. About his mother, about his secret education, about the night in the swamp when he stood up to save a stranger's life. Abraham listened without interrupting, his old eyes growing brighter with every word. When Isaac finished, Abraham nodded slowly. He said that he had been doing this a long time, that he had met a lot of runaways, some brave, some scared, some just desperate, but he had never met anyone like Isaac. He stood up, joints creaking, and told Isaac to bring his giant. He would take them across that night when the moon was dark, no charge. Isaac asked why he would do that when he did not even know them. Abraham replied that freedom was not something you buy. It was something you fight for. And anyone willing to fight as hard as Isaac and Addis deserved all the help he could give. That night, under a moonless sky, Abraham's ferry carried Isaac Mercer and Odyssey across the Mississippi River. It was the first major crossing of their journey, the first step out of Louisiana and into the unknown territories beyond. As they reached the far shore, Odyssey turned to look back at the land they were leaving behind. Somewhere in that darkness was the plantation where she had suffered, the swamp where she had almost died, the life of pain and despair that she was finally escaping. She observed that they were not free yet, that they had so far still to go. Isaac acknowledged this but pointed out that they were closer than they were yesterday, and tomorrow they would be closer still. Abraham helped them ashore and pointed north. He told them to follow the river for about 20 meters where they would find a farm owned by a Quaker family named Henderson. They should tell them Abraham sent them. The Hendersons would give them food and shelter and point them to the next stop on the road. Isaac recognized what Abraham was describing, the Underground Railroad. Abraham smiled, noting that Isaac really had read everything. He confirmed that the railroad was real, and that it worked. Not perfectly, not always safely, but it worked. If they followed the stations, did what they were told, kept their heads down and their feet moving, they would make it to freedom. He had seen it happen hundreds of times. Isaac thanked him, saying he would never forget what Abraham had done for them. Abraham told him not to thank him, just to make it count, make their freedom mean something. That was thanks enough. They parted ways on the riverbank, Abraham heading back to his ferry, Isaac and Adai heading north into Mississippi. The road ahead was long and dangerous. They were still hundreds of miles from safety, still hunted by men who would kill them for the reward. But they were no longer alone. They had allies now, people who would risk their own lives to help strangers reach freedom, and with every step they took, they left the past a little further behind. The Henderson farm sat at the end of a dirt road hidden from the main routes by a thick stand of pine trees. Isaac and Adai reached it just before dawn, their bodies aching from the 20-mile walk. The farmhouse was small but well kept, with whitewashed walls and a red barn behind it. Smoke rose from the chimney, promising warmth and safety. Isaac approached the front door alone, leaving a D's hidden in the treine. He knocked 3 times, then twice, then once, a pattern Abraham had taught him. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and kind eyes that seemed to see right through him. He told her that Abraham had sent them and that they needed help. The woman looked past him, scanning the darkness. She asked how many. Isaac explained there were 2, himself and a woman who was sick and needed rest. The woman told him to bring her inside quickly before the sun came up. The Henderson family asked no questions. They provided food, water, clean clothes, and a place to sleep in their root cellar, which had been converted into a hidden room behind a false wall. It was cramped and dark, but it was safe. For the first time in over a week, Isaac and Adai slept without fear. They stayed with the Hendersons for 3 days. During that time, Isaac learned more about the Underground Railroad than he had ever known from books. The network was vast and intricate, stretching from the deep south all the way to Canada. It operated through a system of codes and signals that allowed conductors to communicate without being detected. A lit candle in a window meant the house was safe. A quilt with certain patterns hung on a fence indicated which direction to travel. Songs sung in the fields contained hidden messages about escape routes and safe houses. The Hendersons were Quakers, members of the Religious Society of Friends. Their faith taught them that all people were equal in the eyes of God and that slavery was a sin against humanity. They had been helping runaways since the 1820s, risking their lives and their property to ferry enslaved people to freedom. In 30 years, they had helped over 200 people escape. On the 3rd night, a wagon arrived at the farm. The driver was a white man named Thomas, young and nervous with the soft hands of someone who had never done hard labor. He was a seminary student from Ohio, spending his summer break working for the railroad. His job was to transport runaways from station to station, hidden under loads of hay or produce. Thomas examined Adis with barely concealed amazement, noting that there was room for both of them, but that they would need extra hay to cover her. They were headed to the next station about 40 miles north. From there, someone else would take them further. The journey in the wagon was uncomfortable but uneventful. Thomas drove through the night, stopping only to rest the horses and check on his passengers. Isaac and Adai lay hidden beneath a mountain of hay, breathing through gaps in the stalks, listening to the sounds of the world passing by above them. They heard other travelers on the road, farmers heading to market, families traveling between towns. Once they heard the thunder of hooves as a group of riders galloped past. Thomas tensed on his seat, ready to run if necessary. But the riders continued on without stopping, just travelers in a hurry, nothing more. The next station was a church in a small town whose name Isaac never learned. The pastor was a black man, a former slave himself, who had escaped 20 years earlier and returned to the South to help others find the same freedom. He sheltered them in the church basement for 2 days, then passed them on to the next conductor. And so it continued station to station, conductor to conductor. They made their way north through Mississippi and into Tennessee. Each stop brought new faces, new stories, new reminders that they were not alone in their struggle. There were white abolitionists who risked prison and death to help strangers. There were free black people who could have lived comfortable lives but chose instead to fight for their enslaved brothers and sisters. There were former slaves who had made the journey themselves and now dedicated their lives to helping others do the same. Isaac learned something important during these weeks of travel. He learned that the world was not divided simply into good people and bad people, into those who supported slavery and those who opposed it. The world was complicated. There were white people who owned slaves but treated them with kindness, and white people who owned no slaves but hated black people with a burning passion. There were black people who had escaped slavery and never looked back, and black people who risked everything to help those still in chains. What mattered, Isaac realized, was not what you were born as, but what you chose to do. Every person they met along the railroad had made a choice. They had chosen to fight against an evil system, even when that fight cost them dearly. And that choice, more than anything else, defined who they were. Her days grew stronger as they traveled. The rest and regular food restored some of her vitality. She could walk longer distances now, though she still tired easily. The pain in her joints had lessened, partly from the LDN but mostly from hope. For the first time in 20 years, she had something to live for. She told Isaac more stories during their long nights of travel. She described the gods of her people, powerful spirits who controlled the forces of nature and guided the destinies of men. She explained the rituals and ceremonies that marked the passages of life from birth to death and everything in between. She spoke of the warriors of her village, men and women who trained from childhood to protect their community from harm. She told Isaac that in her country, a young man like him would be celebrated. His intelligence, his courage, his ability to see what others missed. These were gifts from the gods. He would be trained as a leader, perhaps even as a king. Isaac replied that they were not in her country, that they were in America, and in America he was nothing but property. Adai corrected him firmly. She told him he was not property and never had been. Property cannot think, cannot dream, cannot love. He did all of these things. The laws of this country might call him property, but the laws of this country were wrong. And one day those laws would change. She might not live to see it, but he would. He would live to see a day when no one in America was property. And when that day came, she wanted him to remember that he was always free. In his heart, in his soul, he was always free. The chains were on his body, not on his spirit. They crossed into Kentucky in early October, nearly a month after their escape from Louisiana. The leaves were changing color, painting the hills in shades of red and gold. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the promise of winter. They were less than 100 miles from the Ohio River, now less than 100 miles from freedom. But the closer they got to freedom, the more dangerous the journey became. Kentucky was a slave state, but it bordered free territory. Slave catchers patrolled the roads day and night, watching for runaways trying to make the final crossing. The rewards for capture were highest here, where success was almost within reach. Many runaways had come this far only to be caught within sight of the promised land. The station in Kentucky was different from the others. It was not a farm or a church, but a cave hidden in the hills outside a town called Maysville. The conductor was a woman named Harriet, a former slave who had escaped from Maryland 15 years earlier and made over a dozen trips back south to guide others to freedom. She was small and fierce with scars on her back from the whip and a pistol on her hip that she was not afraid to use. Harriet acknowledged that they had come a long way, that Louisiana to Kentucky was no small journey. Most people did not make it half that far. Isaac explained that they had helped good people along the way. Harriet agreed that good people were the only reason any of them made it, but she warned that good people could only do so much. The last stretch was the hardest. The river was watched. The catchers knew all the crossing points. They would have to be smart, and they would have to be lucky. She studied Adai with a critical eye, recognizing her as the giant test she had heard about. She reported that there was now a $1,000 reward on Addie's head. Isaac was stunned. $1,000 was more money than most people earned in a lifetime. Harriet explained that word spread fast when something unusual happened. A giant woman and a young man outsmarting slave catchers all the way from Louisiana was the kind of story that made planters nervous. They wanted them caught and made an example of. They wanted to show the other slaves that escape was impossible. Adai pointed out that they had escaped, that they were there. Harriet smiled grimly and corrected her. They were not escaped yet. They would not be escaped until they were standing on free soil with no one chasing them. And right now, there were a lot of people chasing them. She was right. Over the next few days, they saw evidence of the hunt everywhere. Wanted posters with their descriptions were nailed to trees and fence posts. Groups of armed men patrolled the roads, stopping travelers to check their papers. Dogs were brought in from as far away as Virginia, specially trained to track runaway slaves across any terrain. Harriet kept them hidden in the cave, venturing out only at night to gather information and supplies. She had contacts throughout the area, free black people and sympathetic whites who passed along news of the hunters' movements. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the stakes being life and death. On their 5th night in the cave, Harriet returned with troubling news. She reported that a man was leading the search, a professional catcher named Silas Crenshaw. He had come up from Louisiana specifically to find them. Isaac felt his blood run cold. He knew that name. Crenshaw was the overseer at the Bellamy plantation. He was the one who tried to burn Adai in the swamp. Harriet explained that Crenshaw had been tracking them the whole way, following their trail station by station. He was good at what he did. They said he had never lost a runaway he set his mind to catching. Adis had gone very still. Her face was unreadable, but Isaac could see something burning in her eyes, something old and deep and dangerous. She said quietly that she knew more about Crena than he knew about her. When Isaac asked what she meant, she was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She revealed that Silas Crenshaw and she had the same father. Isaac stared at her in disbelief. She explained that Crenshaw's father was a planter in Virginia named William Crenshaw. He owned the plantation where she was first sold after arriving from Africa. He was a cruel man, violent and drunk most of the time. He raped her mother within a week of her arrival. Adais was born 9 months later. Isaac understood the implications. Silas was her half-brother. They shared the same blood. He was the son of the master raised in the big house with fine clothes and education. She was the daughter of a slave raised in the quarters with chains and whips. Same father, different fate. Isaac asked if Crenshaw knew if he knew she was his sister. Adis laughed bitterly. He had always known. When they were children before she was sold away, they lived on the same plantation. They saw each other every day. He knew who she was. He knew what his father had done to her mother, and he hated her for it. He hated her because her existence was proof of his father's sin. He hated her because every time he looked at her, he saw the truth about his family. Isaac asked if that was why Crenshaw tried to kill her in the swamp. Adis confirmed that he had been trying to kill her for 20 years. Every time she was sold, every time she was moved to a new plantation, he found a way to follow. He would appear as an overseer or a hired hand, always watching, always waiting. He told her once that he would not rest until she was dead, until there was no evidence left of what his father had done. Isaac understood now why Crenshaw had been so eager to burn Adais in the swamp. It was not just about money or property. It was personal. It was about erasing a shameful truth about destroying the living reminder of his father's crimes. Isaac insisted that they had to go that night before Crenshaw found them. Harriet shook her head. The river crossings were all watched. Crenshaw had men at every point between there and Cincinnati. They would be walking into a trap. Isaac replied that they would find another way. There had to be another way. They planned through the night. Harriet knew the territory better than anyone, every path and stream and hiding place within 50 miles. She drew maps in the dirt, explaining the options and the risks. There was only one route that might work, a dangerous path through the backcountry that would bring them to the river at an unguarded point. Harriet warned them that it was rough terrain. Hills and hollows, dense forest, no trails to follow. It would take 3 days to cover what would normally be a 1-day journey, and if the hunters picked up their trail, there would be nowhere to hide. Isaac insisted that the hunters would not pick up their trail. They had made it that far. They would make it the rest of the way. They set out at midnight, leaving the cave behind and heading into the wilderness. Harriet guided them for the first few miles, showing them landmarks and giving final instructions. Then she embraced them both and disappeared back into the darkness, whispering that God would speed them and that she would see them on the other side. The next 3 days were the hardest of the entire journey. The terrain was exactly as brutal as Harriet had warned. They climbed steep hills and descended into shadowy hollows. They waded through streams and crawled through thickets of thorns. They slept in the open, huddled together for warmth. As the October nights grew colder, Adai struggled with every step. The rough ground was agony on her damaged joints. Several times she fell, unable to catch herself, and Isaac had to help her back to her feet. But she never complained. She never asked to stop. She kept moving forward, one painful step at a time, driven by a determination that went beyond mere survival. On the second night, they heard dogs in the distance, the baying of hounds on a scent, the sound that had haunted their journey from the very beginning. Crenshaw had found their trail. Isaac quickened their pace, pushing them harder than he had ever pushed before. They abandoned their planned route and headed straight for the river, no longer caring about stealth or caution. Speed was all that mattered now. Speed and luck and the stubborn refusal to give up. They reached the Ohio River on the morning of the third day. It stretched before them like a silver ribbon, perhaps a quarter-mile wide, flowing quietly in the early light. On the far shore was Ohio, free soil, safety. But between them and freedom stood Silas Crenshaw. He emerged from the treine with a dozen men at his back. They were armed with rifles and pistols, their faces grim with purpose. The dogs strained at their leashes, barking frantically at the sight of their prey. Crenshaw himself was a tall man, lean and weathered with pale eyes that held no mercy. He walked toward them slowly, savoring the moment, a smile playing on his thin lips. He announced that it was the end of the road, acknowledging that they had given him a good chase, better than most. But it was over now. Isaac stepped in front of Adaz as if his body could somehow shield her from what was coming. He urged Crenshaw to let them go, pointing out that they were almost free. Just let them walk across that river. Crenshaw laughed. He asked if Isaac knew how much money he had spent tracking them, how many miles he had traveled. He declared that he had been chasing Odyssey for 20 years. He was not about to let her go when he was that close to finishing it. Isaac told Crenshaw that she was his sister, his own blood. The smile vanished from Crenshaw's face. He demanded to know who told Isaac that. Isaac replied that Adez had told him everything, about Crenshaw's father, about what he did, about why Crenshaw had been hunting her all these years. Crenshaw's face twisted with rage. He denied that she was his sister, calling her an animal, a thing. His father's shame made flesh. He declared that he was going to erase that shame once and for all. He raised his rifle and aimed it at Ada's chest. What happened next would be remembered in the region for generations. Some called it a miracle, others called it madness. But everyone who witnessed it agreed on one thing. They had never seen anything like it. Adai moved. Not slowly, not painfully, not like a sick woman who could barely walk. She moved like the warrior she had been born to be, like the daughter of chiefs and priestesses, like a force of nature that could not be stopped by mortal men. She grabbed Isaac and threw him toward the river. He sailed through the air and landed in the shallow water near the shore, too shocked to even cry out. Then she turned to face the men who had come to kill her. Crenshaw fired his rifle. The bullet struck her in the shoulder, spinning her half around, but she did not fall. She lunged forward and grabbed the rifle from his hands, snapping it in two like a dry twig. One of the other men fired. Another bullet struck her in the side. Still, she did not fall. She fought like a demon, like an avenging angel, like something out of the old stories, the legends of warriors who could not be killed by ordinary weapons. Men went down before her like wheat before a scythe. Bones broke. Blood flowed. Screams filled the air. Isaac watched from the water, frozen with horror and awe. He wanted to help, wanted to do something, but he could not move. All he could do was watch as Adez fought her final battle. It lasted less than 5 minutes. When it was over, 12 men lay on the riverbank. 9 of them would never rise again. 3 were crawling away into the trees, too broken to walk, lucky to be alive. Silas Crenshaw was one of the survivors. He lay on his back with both legs shattered, staring up at the woman who had destroyed his men with her bare hands. Blood ran down his face from a gash on his forehead. His pale eyes were wide with terror. Ada Easy stood over him, breathing hard, her body riddled with wounds that should have killed her. Blood soaked her clothes and dripped onto the ground. She looked like death itself come to claim what was owed. She told him that he had hunted her for 20 years. He tried to destroy her because she reminded him of what his father was, but he could not destroy truth. He could not erase shame by killing the innocent. His father's sin was written in his own blood. Every time he looked in a mirror, he would see it. Every time he closed his eyes, he would remember that moment. That was her gift to him. That was her revenge. She raised her foot to crush his skull. Then she stopped. Slowly, she lowered her foot and stepped back. She told him that she would not kill him. He was not worth the stain on her soul. He would live with what he was. He would live with what he had done. And every day for the rest of his miserable life, he would know that she could have ended him. And she chose mercy instead. She turned away from him and walked toward the river. Each step was slower than the last. The light was fading from her eyes, but she kept walking, kept moving toward the water, toward freedom, toward Isaac. She reached the shore and collapsed. Isaac caught her as she fell, though her weight drove him to his knees. He held her there in the shallow water, her blood mixing with the current that flowed toward Ohio. She whispered for him to go, to swim. It was not far. He could make it. Isaac refused to leave without her. She smiled, and despite everything, it was the most beautiful thing Isaac had ever seen. She told him that he had already saved her. That night in the swamp, he had saved her soul. He gave her hope when she had none left. He gave her a reason to live. Because of him, she died free. Because of him, she died human. Isaac insisted that she was not going to die, that they were going to cross together, that they were going to make it. She told him that she was already across. She was already home. She reached up and touched his face with a bloody hand. She asked him to remember her, to tell her story, to tell them about Ada of Nequer, daughter of chiefs, sister of warriors, to tell them she fought, to tell them she never stopped fighting, not until the very end. Her eyes closed, her breathing slowed. And there in the waters of the Ohio River, just yards from free soil, Adiz died in the arms of the young man who had saved her. Isaac held her for a long time. He wept until he had no tears left. He screamed at the sky until his voice was gone. He begged God, begged the spirits of Adizi's ancestors, begged anyone who might be listening to bring her back. But death does not bargain. Death does not negotiate. When death comes, there is no arguing with its verdict. Finally, Isaac did the only thing he could do. He started swimming. The river was cold and the current was strong, but Isaac was desperate. He fought against the water with everything he had, driven by a fury that would not let him stop. Behind him, on the Kentucky shore, Silas Crenshaw lay broken among the bodies of his men. Before him, growing closer with every stroke, was Ohio. He reached the far shore just as the sun was setting. He dragged himself onto the bank and lay there, gasping, too exhausted to move. He had made it. He was on free soil. He was safe. But he did not feel free. He did not feel safe. He felt empty, hollow, like something essential had been torn out of him and left behind on the other side of the river. He walked north through the darkness, following the roads that Harriet had described. Sometime around midnight, he reached a farmhouse with a candle burning in the window. He knocked on the door and collapsed into the arms of the strangers who answered. They were conductors on the Underground Railroad. They had been expecting him. Word traveled fast along the network, and they knew about the giant woman and the young man who were trying to cross into Ohio. They took him in, fed him, gave him clean clothes and a warm bed. But when they asked about Adaz, Isaac could not answer. He could not find the words to describe what had happened on the riverbank. All he could do was shake his head and weep. He stayed with the family for 2 weeks, recovering his strength. They asked no questions about his past and made no demands about his future. When he was ready to leave, they gave him money, supplies, and directions to the next station on the road to Canada. But Isaac did not go to Canada. He had a different destination in mind. He made his way to Cincinnati, the largest city in Ohio, where there was a community of free black people and escaped slaves. He found work as a laborer in a warehouse, saving every penny he earned. He found teachers who would help him continue his education, learning to read and write at a level far beyond what he had taught himself. He found abolitionists who were fighting to end slavery, and he joined their cause with all the passion in his young heart. Years passed. Isaac grew from a young man into a full adult. He watched as the nation tore itself apart over the question of slavery as politicians argued and compromised and failed to solve the fundamental injustice at the heart of American society. He watched as war finally came, as the Union and the Confederacy clashed in battles that killed more Americans than all previous wars combined. In 1863, when President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation and allowed black men to serve in the Union Army, Isaac enlisted. He was 21 years old, tall and strong, hardened by years of labor and loss. He joined the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments in the United States military. The 54th Massachusetts was formed in March of 1863, just 2 months after Lincoln's proclamation took effect. The regiment was led by white officers, as was required by law, but its soldiers were all black men. Some were freeborn Northerners, others were escaped slaves from the South. All of them were fighting for something larger than themselves, the destruction of slavery and the promise of a new America. Isaac trained at Camp Meigs outside Boston, learning to march and shoot and fight as part of a unit. He discovered that he had a natural talent for soldiering. His years of invisibility had taught him patience and observation. His time on the Underground Railroad had taught him endurance and courage. His memory of AD had taught him that some things were worth dying for. The 54th Massachusetts saw its first major action on July 18, 1863, at the Battle of Fort Wagner. Fort Wagner was a Confederate stronghold on Morris Island, South Carolina, guarding the approach to Charleston Harbor. The Union command decided that taking the fort would be a crucial step toward capturing Charleston itself, the birthplace of secession and the symbolic heart of the Confederacy. The assault was a disaster. The 54th led the charge across 600 yards of open beach under withering fire from the Confederate defenders. Men fell by the dozens, by the scores, by the hundreds. The regiment lost nearly half its strength in less than an hour, including its commanding officer, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw, who was killed leading his men over the fort's walls. Isaac was among those who made it to the walls. He climbed over the parapet and fought hand-to-hand with Confederate soldiers in the darkness. He killed men and watched his friends die beside him. He was wounded twice, once in the arm and once in the leg, but he kept fighting until the order came to retreat. The Union forces failed to take Fort Wagner that night, but the courage of the 54th Massachusetts changed the course of the war. Their sacrifice proved that black soldiers could fight as bravely as white soldiers, that they were willing to die for their country and their freedom. In the months that followed, nearly 200,000 black men enlisted in the Union Army. Many of them cited the example of the 54th as their inspiration. Isaac recovered from his wounds and returned to duty. He fought in skirmishes and sieges across the South. He saw friends die beside him, and enemies fall before him. He learned what it meant to fight for something larger than himself, something worth dying for. And through it all, he never forgot a daze. He carried her memory with him like a talisman, a reminder of what courage really meant. When fear threatened to overwhelm him, he remembered her standing on the riverbank facing down a dozen armed men with nothing but her bare hands. When despair crept in during the darkest hours, he remembered her smile as she lay dying at peace with herself and the world. The war ended in April of 1865 with the surrender of the Confederate Army at Appomattox Courthouse. Slavery was over. The chains were broken. 4 million people who had been property were now free, at least under the law. Isaac was 23 years old. He had survived the war, survived the impossible journey from Louisiana to Ohio, survived everything that life had thrown at him, and now he had one final task to complete. He went back to Kentucky. Silas Crenshaw had survived the battle on the riverbank, but he had never recovered. His legs had been shattered beyond repair. He spent the rest of the war in a wheelchair, bitter and broken, watching as the world he had known collapsed around him. The plantation he had hoped to inherit was destroyed by Union troops. The fortune he had counted on evaporated in the chaos of defeat. By 1865, he was living in a rundown boarding house in Maysville, a shell of the man he had once been. Isaac found him there, sitting on the porch in his wheelchair, staring at nothing. The pale eyes that had once burned with hatred were now dull and empty. The lean body that had once radiated menace was now wasted and weak. Isaac stood before him in his Union uniform, a soldier of the victorious army, a free man in a nation that had finally chosen freedom. He asked if Crenshaw remembered him. Crenshaw looked up slowly. Recognition flickered in his eyes, then fear. He identified Isaac as the reading slave. Isaac corrected him. His name was Isaac Mercer. He was there when Crenshaw tried to burn Adis. He was there when she broke Crenshaw's legs and left him alive. And he was there now to finish what she started. Crenshaw's hands trembled on the arms of his wheelchair. He looked around for help, but there was no one. The boarding house was empty. The streets were quiet. They were alone. Isaac reached into his coat and pulled out a piece of paper. It was old and worn, folded many times over many years. He unfolded it carefully and held it up for Crenshaw to see. It was the wanted poster from 1859. The one with the rough sketches of a giant woman and a young man. The one that had offered $1,000 for their capture. Isaac let the poster fall into Crenshaw's lap. The broken man stared at it, his face pale as death. Isaac stood there for a long moment, looking down at the man who had haunted his nightmares for 6 years. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. He had dreamed of revenge, of justice, of making Crenshaw pay for everything he had done. He had carried a pistol all the way from Cincinnati, loaded and ready, waiting for this confrontation. But standing there, looking at the broken creature in the wheelchair, Isaac felt something unexpected. He felt pity. Crenshaw had spent his entire life running from the truth about his father, about himself, about the evil he had chosen to embrace. And in the end, that running had led him nowhere. He was alone, crippled, despised, forgotten. He had lost everything he ever valued, and he would spend whatever years remained to him, trapped in that broken body with nothing but his memories and his shame. Isaac realized that killing Shaw would be a mercy. It would end his suffering. It would release him from the prison of his own making, and Adaze had not chosen mercy for that reason. She had chosen mercy because Crenshaw was not worth the cost of vengeance. Isaac put the pistol away. He told Crenshaw that Adaze had spared his life on that riverbank. She could have killed him, but she chose not to. She said he was not worth the stain on her soul. For 6 years, Isaac had wondered if she made the right choice. Now he knew that she had. He told Crenshaw that he was not going to kill him either, but he wanted Crenshaw to know something. He wanted him to know that Adaze won. She died free. She died on her own terms. And her story would be remembered long after Crenshaw was forgotten. People would tell their children about the giant woman who fought her way to freedom. Nobody would tell their children about Silas Crenshaw. Isaac turned and walked away. Behind him, Crenshaw sat in silence, the wanted poster still clutched in his trembling hands. That was the last time Isaac ever saw Silas Crenshaw. The former overseer died 3 years later, alone in that same boarding house of causes that no one bothered to record. His grave was unmarked, his name forgotten, his legacy nothing but dust. Isaac Mercer lived for another 50 years. He became a teacher, then a principal, then a leader in his community. He married a woman named Sarah, a former slave from Virginia, and they had 4 children together. He told his children about Adaze, and they told their children, and those children told their children after them. The story passed down through generations, changing a little with each telling, but always keeping the essential truth at its heart. In his final years, Isaac wrote down the story of his escape with Adaze. He wanted to make sure it would survive after he was gone, that future generations would know what she had sacrificed and what she had achieved. He titled the manuscript The Giant of Nquare, a true account of courage and freedom. The manuscript was lost for many years, passing through the hands of collectors and historians who did not recognize its significance. It was rediscovered in 1947 in the attic of a house in Cincinnati that had once been a stop on the Underground Railroad. Historians verified its authenticity and published it for the first time in 1952, nearly a century after the events it described. The story of Isaac Mercer and Ada became part of the larger story of American resistance to slavery. It was taught in schools and told in churches. It was cited by civil rights leaders as an example of courage in the face of impossible odds. It reminded people that freedom was never given. It had to be fought for, suffered for, and sometimes died for. Isaac died in 1909 at the age of 67. He was buried in a cemetery in Cincinnati beside his wife Sarah, who had passed away 2 years earlier. His tombstone bore a simple inscription that he had chosen himself. It read, "He stood up." Those 3 words captured everything that mattered about Isaac Mercer's life. He was born into slavery with no rights, no freedom, and no future. But when he saw injustice, he did not look away. When he saw suffering, he did not turn his back. When he saw a woman being led to her death, he stood up. That choice made in a moment of impossible courage changed everything. It saved a life. It preserved a story. It proved that the human spirit could not be chained, no matter what laws or customs or cruelties tried to bind it. Ade never reached the free soil of Ohio. Her body lies somewhere on the Kentucky shore of the river in an unmarked grave that has long since been forgotten. But her spirit crossed that river 1,000 times over, carried in the hearts of everyone who heard her story and was inspired by her sacrifice. She was a dyer of Nquare, daughter of chiefs, sister of warriors. She was stolen from her home, stripped of her humanity, and subjected to horrors that no person should ever endure. But she never stopped fighting. She never stopped hoping. And in the end, she proved that freedom is not a place you reach, it is a choice you make. Isaac Mercer understood that lesson better than anyone. He carried it with him for the rest of his life, and he passed it on to everyone he met. He taught his students that they were not defined by their circumstances but by their choices. He taught his children that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite fear. He taught everyone who would listen that impossible things become possible when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice. The world that Isaac and our days were born into no longer exists. Slavery is abolished. The laws that once defined human beings as property have been swept away. But the struggle for freedom continues in new forms and new places against new enemies and old hatreds. The story of the giant woman and the reading slave reminds us where we came from. It reminds us what our ancestors endured and what they achieved. It reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that freedom must be defended in every generation. And it reminds us that sometimes when all seems lost, when the darkness closes in and hope fades away, someone stands up. Someone refuses to accept the unacceptable. Someone chooses to fight even when fighting seems futile. That is the legacy of Isaac Mercer and a Dees of Inquirer. That is the lesson they left for all of us. They stood up.